Harry Williams, a 75-year-old veteran, sat quietly at a small corner table in a bustling cafe. The room buzzed with the vibrant hum of conversations and the clinking of dishes, creating an atmosphere that was both lively and chaotic. Yet Harry seemed untouched by the animated energy around him. His weathered face carried a calm expression, and his demeanor exuded a quiet dignity. Dressed modestly in a worn yet meticulously clean jacket, Harry's appearance reflected a man who had lived through countless trials but had never lost his sense of self-respect. His gnarled hands, marked by years of labor and service, rested on a steaming cup of coffee he had ordered more to occupy himself than to quench any thirst. His eyes, deep-set and thoughtful, occasionally flicked to the door, filled with anticipation as he waited for his son, who was running late. Unbeknownst to Harry, this seemingly ordinary day would soon unravel into a harrowing ordeal of humiliation and challenges that would test his resilience. As Harry waited patiently, the cafe door swung open with a loud creak, drawing the attention of several patrons. Two police officers, George and Gilbert, entered, their presence commanding the room. Their polished badges gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and their confident strides reflected their authority. They scanned the room briefly, their eyes darting from table to table, searching for a spot to settle. However, their gaze lingered on Harry, who sat alone in his modest attire, quietly sipping his coffee. Something about his simple demeanor and his outdated, weathered clothing seemed to capture their attention, a sharp contrast to the affluent clientele that populated the upscale neighborhood cafe. George leaned toward Gilbert, whispering something inaudible, his lips curling into a smirk. Gilbert chuckled softly, their shared laughter tinged with derision. To them, Harry appeared out of place, an anomaly in an environment designed for the well-to-do. The officers, driven by idle curiosity and a sense of superiority, decided to approach him, their minds already clouded by judgment and prejudice. Without so much as a polite greeting, George broke the silence with a sharp question, his tone carrying an edge of suspicion. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his words abrupt and dismissive. The lack of civility in his approach was evident, his attitude conveying a sense of entitlement rather than professionalism. Harry looked up from his coffee, his expression calm and untroubled, and replied in a measured tone, "I'm waiting for my son." His voice carried the steady strength of a man who had weathered life's storms. Gilbert, emboldened by George's demeanor, joined in with a sneer. "Doesn't seem like the kind of place for someone like you," he remarked, his voice dripping with condescension. "Old man trying to mingle with the rich folk, huh?" He chuckled, as though his comment was a stroke of wit. The words hung in the air, laced with the intention of belittling Harry. Harry didn't flinch. His years of military service and a lifetime of enduring prejudice had steeled him against such petty provocations. He repeated his earlier statement, his tone unwavering, explaining that he was there to meet his son. But his composure only seemed to aggravate the officers further, as though his dignity was a personal affront to their authority. George, now visibly irritated, demanded to see Harry's ID. The request was less about protocol and more about exerting dominance. Without hesitation, Harry reached into his pocket and retrieved his veteran ID card, a symbol of honor that represented his years of dedicated service to his country. He handed it over calmly, his steady hands betraying no sign of unease. George glanced at the card briefly before dismissing it with a scoff. "This can't be real," he muttered, tossing the card back onto the table with a flick of his wrist. "A guy like you? A veteran? You're probably just some dishwasher trying to pull a fast one." Gilbert, eager to contribute to the ridicule, echoed George's disdain. "Yeah, back in your day, guys like you didn't serve in the military. You cleaned up after people like us." His words were laced with venom, each one aimed at stripping Harry of his dignity. But Harry remained stoic, his silence a quiet act of defiance against their attempts to demean him. The cafe patrons, who had initially been engrossed in their conversations, began to take notice of the unfolding scene. Some turned their heads to watch, their faces reflecting a mix of curiosity and discomfort, while others pretended not to see, unwilling to involve themselves. The lively chatter that had filled the room earlier now gave way to an oppressive silence as the tension between the officers and Harry escalated. George, emboldened by the lack of intervention from the patrons, leaned closer to Harry, his voice dripping with contempt. "If you don't leave, we'll drag you out," he threatened, his tone cold and unwavering. Harry, still seated, looked at them with steady eyes, his hands resting firmly on the table. He said nothing, his silence speaking volumes. His unyielding composure seemed to infuriate George further. In a show of authority, George knocked over the chair beside Harry with a loud crash, the sound reverberating through the room and startling everyone present. He grabbed Harry's arm roughly, twisting it behind his back with a force that caused visible pain. Harry winced but refused to cry out, his resolve unbroken. Meanwhile, Gilbert picked up Harry's veteran hat, which had been resting on the table. The hat, though old and faded, was a cherished symbol of Harry's service and pride. Gilbert inspected it with disdain before tossing it to the floor dismissively. "You don't need this anymore," he sneered, his words a deliberate attempt to undermine Harry's sense of worth. For the first time, a flicker of anger crossed Harry's face, but he held his tongue, refusing to give the officers the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. The cafe patrons, now visibly uneasy, began to murmur among themselves. Some discreetly took out their phones to record the incident, their expressions a mix of concern and apprehension. Yet, no one stepped forward to intervene, their silence a stark reflection of society's indifference. As George prepared to handcuff Harry, the veteran finally spoke. "You don't know who I am," he said, his voice steady and filled with quiet strength. "You haven't seen half the horrors I've faced." His words carried a weight that seemed to momentarily pierce through the officer's bravado. George, unimpressed, responded with a sneer. "You think you can lecture us? Tonight, you'll sleep in a cell for resisting. Let's see who will save you now." With that, he snapped the handcuffs onto Harry's wrists, the metallic click echoing ominously. Gilbert, not to be outdone, took Harry's cane, a lifeline the veteran had leaned on for years, and broke it over his knee with a triumphant smirk. He tossed the pieces aside, the act a final insult to Harry's dignity. Before they could drag Harry out of the cafe, he gestured toward the table with a subtle nod. "Look at the card," he said simply, his voice calm but firm. George, irritated but curious, picked up the ID card again. As his eyes scanned the name printed on it, his expression changed instantly. The blood drained from his face, his earlier confidence replaced by a look of sheer panic. The name on the card read, Commissioner Robert Williams. At that moment, the door to the cafe opened once more, and in walked Commissioner Robert Williams himself. His commanding presence immediately silenced the room, the weight of his authority palpable. His sharp eyes quickly took in the scene before him. The broken cane, the handcuffs on his father's wrists, and the officers' now ashen faces. Without raising his voice, the commissioner addressed the officers with a single, chilling question. "What have you done?" His tone was calm, but the underlying menace was unmistakable. The room remained hushed, every patron holding their breath, awaiting the fallout of the officer's actions.